The rhythmic creak of a water wheel and the deep thud of millstones once defined the medieval landscape. We picture the miller as a simple peasant, covered in flour and little different from the farmers around him. Yet this humble craftsman was often the wealthiest and most powerful person for miles around. How did the man who merely ground grain amass a fortune that could rival a lord's? By the end of this story, you will know the exact secrets these powerful figures used to build their hidden empires. We will uncover the legal tricks that forced every villager to be his customer and the clever schemes that siphoned wealth from every sack of grain. What does it truly take to turn the necessities of life into a personal fortune? That rhythmic creak of the water wheel was not just the sound of industry, it was the sound of law. The miller's wealth began with a piece of parchment, a formal grant from the local lord known as a soak right. This was not a simple business license, it was a feudal monopoly. The lord declared that milling was a banned enterprise for everyone else. Every peasant living on the manor's land was legally forced to bring their grain to the lord's mill and no other. Think of it like your entire town having only one grocery store and a law preventing you from shopping anywhere else or even growing your own food in a backyard garden. For a medieval peasant, that backyard garden was a small hand mill called a quern. Owning or using one was a serious crime. Lords employed officials to sniff out the telltale sounds of grinding stone in a peasant's home. Getting caught meant a heavy fine, a punishment that could cost a family weeks of their meager income, so the miller did not need to compete for customers. His customers were delivered to him by decree, a captive audience for life. This legally enforced stream of people was the absolute bedrock of his economic power. He stood at a single, authorized choke point for one of life's most basic necessities. With a captive stream of customers guaranteed by law, the miller now activated his true money-making machine, a fee known as the multure or the toll. This was not a simple, flat payment. The miller's income was a direct percentage of the grain you brought to him, typically 1/16 or even 1/12 of your entire harvest. Picture a farmer, his cart laden after a long season of backbreaking labor. He arrives at the mill with 16 heavy sacks of wheat, the product of his family's entire year. After the grinding is done, he does not get 16 sacks of flour back, he gets 15. The miller, for his service, keeps one full sack for himself. This system was ingeniously brutal. It meant the miller's wealth was not fixed. It grew in direct proportion to the village's own success. In a year of plenty, when the harvests were bountiful and every farmer's cart was overflowing, the miller's share grew just as large. His granaries would swell while those of his neighbors merely remained stable. He became a direct and often the primary financial beneficiary of the community's collective agricultural labor. His personal fortune was literally built one scooped measure of grain at a time, taken from every single person who needed to eat. But the miller's wealth did not stop with the grain toll. His true genius lay in transforming the mill itself from a single-purpose machine into a bustling industrial hub. That same water wheel, powered by the river's relentless flow, could be adapted to drive more than just millstones. With a system of gears, cams, and shafts, the rotating wheel was converted into a powerful, repetitive pounding force. This opened up entirely new industries right under the miller's roof. One of the most common was the fulling of woolen cloth. Raw, woven wool is loose and greasy. To make it thick and tight, it must be pounded in a mixture of water and clay. This backbreaking job, once done by human feet in troughs, was taken over by massive, water-powered wooden hammers. For a fee, clothiers would bring their bolts of wool to the miller's fulling mill, where his mechanical hammers did the work in a fraction of the time. This was just the beginning. The same pounding mechanism could be redirected to a forge, creating a trip hammer for shaping red-hot metal, or to a stamp mill for crushing oak bark, a key ingredient in the tanning of leather. Each of these operations represented another stream of income for the miller. He charged a stream rent for the use of his water power and his machinery. Think of it like a medieval landlord renting out space in a high-tech industrial park, a park that he owned and powered all by himself. This diversification was his financial armor. In a year of poor harvests, when the flow of grain slowed, his fulling hammers might still be pounding away, his forge hammers still ringing. While a farmer's fortunes rose and fell with the weather, the miller had built a resilient economic empire, powered by water and protected by law, ensuring his wealth was never tied to just one trade. This technological marvel, however, came with an immense price tag. Constructing a watermill was one of the most significant capital investments of the entire medieval era. It was not a matter of simply nailing a few planks together by the river. The water wheel itself was a massive wooden structure engineered to withstand the constant force of the current. Its axle had to be a single, huge, and perfectly shaped oak log. The gears, known as the pit wheel and the wallower, were intricate wooden masterpieces of pegged teeth that had to mesh with flawless precision to transfer power from the horizontal wheel to the vertical millstone. And then there were the millstones themselves. These were not just any rocks. They were special quarry stones, often imported from distant regions famous for their hard, sharp grit. A single pair could be worth more than a peasant's house. The cost of the timber, the iron fittings, the skilled carpentry, and the stones was staggering. For a common peasant, it was an impossible sum, the work of many lifetimes. This created a natural and insurmountable barrier to entry. The mill was not just a building, it was a piece of high-tech village infrastructure, as vital and as complex as a power station is today. And the man who controlled it, the miller, held that position not through simple hard work, but through inheritance or by being the appointed agent of the Lord. He was the guardian of a machine so advanced and so expensive that no one else could possibly own or operate it. This technological monopoly cemented his power, making his position utterly unassailable by the very people who depended on his service. This position at the helm of a complex machine transformed the miller from a mere craftsman into something entirely new, one of the world's first true industrialists. He was not a subsistence farmer working his own small plot. He was a manager, a capitalist, and a technical expert all rolled into one. His day was not spent following an ox-drawn plow, but in coordinating the entire industrial process of his mill. He had to manage the flow of raw materials, the grain arriving from dozens of different farms, ensuring it was stored properly and processed in some kind of order. He then oversaw the transformation of that grain into a finished product, the fine flour that would be carefully weighed and returned. This required a level of organization and foresight completely alien to the seasonal rhythms of the farm. He was running a factory, and its product was the very bread on every table. To keep this factory running, the miller did not work alone. He employed a team of assistants known as the miller's knaves. These men were the cogs in the human machine. One knave might be responsible for managing the incoming farmers, taking their grain and recording their names. Another would be a technical expert, his ears finely tuned to the sounds of the millstones. He would listen for the specific hum and crunch that indicated the stones were perfectly set, grinding the grain to the ideal consistency without burning it. A wrong adjustment could mean ruined flour and angry customers. A third might be a laborer tasked with the back-straining work of hauling heavy sacks or performing essential maintenance on the water wheel and gears. The miller was their boss, a middle manager long before the term existed. He directed their labor, paid their wages, and bore the ultimate responsibility for the mill's output. This role as an employer further separated him from the peasant community, placing him firmly in a managerial class. His responsibilities were relentless. The machinery was under constant strain, and breakdowns were not a matter of if but when. A wooden gear tooth could shatter, the water wheel's axle could develop a dangerous crack. The millstones themselves would slowly wear down, requiring costly and skilled redressing, where their grinding surfaces were re-chiseled with sharp new grooves. The miller had to either possess these advanced carpentry and masonry skills himself or hire and supervise those who did. He was not just using technology, he was perpetually maintaining and repairing it, a never-ending cycle of investment and labor that no common farmer had to consider. This constant demand for capital and skill created a permanent divide. The farmer worried about sun and rain. The miller worried about cash flow, mechanical engineering, and human resources. He was playing an entirely different game on a field he alone could afford to stand on. This immense power over the village's food supply bred a deep and pervasive suspicion. The miller worked in the shadows of his own mill, a place where farmers were often forbidden to enter while their grain was being processed. They would hand over their precious, hard-won sacks at the door, listening to the rhythmic thunder of the stones from outside, completely blind to what happened within. This secrecy was the perfect breeding ground for legends of theft, and the most famous of these was the trick of the false-bottomed sack. Imagine a grain sack that looked perfectly normal on the outside. But inside, a cleverly concealed second layer of cloth was sewn partway up. When a farmer poured his grain into this sack, it would only fill the top compartment, making it seem like he had brought less than he actually had. The miller would then take his multure from this already diminished amount, secretly stealing an even larger portion of the harvest. Another common accusation was that of the cleverly placed kick. As the miller poured grain into the measuring bowl, he might subtly knock the container with his foot, causing the grain to settle more tightly. This allowed him to pack more into the same measured volume, meaning he took a larger physical share for the same declared percentage. The truth of these stories is murky. Some millers were undoubtedly dishonest, exploiting their total control, but for many, such blatant theft was too risky. Getting caught could mean losing the Lord's favor, his license, and his entire livelihood. Yet the suspicion itself was a social tax the miller had to pay. He was resented not just for what he might do, but for what he could do. His closed doors and specialized knowledge made him a figure of mystery and fear in the community, a man everyone needed but no one felt they could truly trust. So where did this wealthy, powerful man fit in the rigid order of medieval society? The miller lived in a social no man's land. He was a free man, legally unbound to the land like a serf, and his coffers often held more coin than a knight of minor gentry. Yet he was still a commoner, barred from the privileges of the noble class. This placed him in a constant state of friction with everyone around him. To the lord in his manor, the miller was a vital but vulgar asset, a money-making machine who was nevertheless invited to the table for business, never for supper. To the peasants who toiled in the fields, he was an object of intense envy. He did not break his back under the sun, yet he ate the finest white bread, paid for with the grain from their own harvest. He was one of them, yet he lived by a different set of rules, wielding a power they could never hope to attain. This in-between status was socially exhausting. He had to constantly navigate the delicate politics of the village, demonstrating enough authority to command his workers and enforce the lord's milling monopoly, while also trying to maintain some semblance of goodwill with his neighbors. A miller who was too aloof and lordly would be despised as an arrogant upstart. A miller who was too familiar and friendly would find his authority undermined at every turn. He walked a tightrope, resented from above for his wealth and from below for his power, a man who belonged entirely to his own unique and lonely class. This cultural suspicion of the miller did not fade with time. It became immortalized in the stories people told, transforming him from a mere man into a powerful literary archetype. Geoffrey Chaucer, in his famous Canterbury Tales, gives us one of the most enduring portraits. His miller is not a quiet, flower-dusted craftsman. He is a brawny, loud-mouthed rogue with a beard as red as a fox and a wart on his nose. He is a wrestler, a brute who tells a story of a cuckolded carpenter, delighting in the humiliation of a more respectable tradesman. Chaucer does not just show us a dishonest man. He shows us a man who revels in his dishonesty, whose wealth and power have made him loud, vulgar, and unashamed. This character was not born from Chaucer's imagination alone. He was a reflection of a deep-seated popular belief. In folklore across Europe, the miller was a perennial villain. He was the greedy figure in the fable who always tried to cheat the simple farmer. He was the man who made a pact with the devil to ensure his mill had the best water flow. These stories were a way for a powerless peasantry to process their resentment. They could not challenge the miller's legal or economic power in the real world, so they defeated him in fiction, outwitting him in tales or watching divine justice punish his greed. The miller's very environment fed this dark reputation. His mill was a liminal space, neither fully part of the village nor entirely separate. It was a place of constant, deafening noise, of shifting shadows and swirling dust, where the normal rules of transparency and community seemed to break down. This physical mystery perfectly mirrored the mystery of his business practices. The folk tales cemented an idea that was already potent in the minds of medieval people. The miller was not just rich, he was rich in a way that felt inherently suspicious. His fortune built not on honest toil but on trickery and a privileged position. He became the perfect villain because his success was a constant, visible reminder of a system that was stacked in his favor, a system where one man could grow fat on the labor of all others. That roaring river was more than a source of power, it was a source of authority. The miller did not simply build his mill on any convenient stream. He chose his location with the strategic eye of a general placing a castle. The ideal spot was a natural bottleneck on the waterway, a place where the current was strong and dependable. By constructing his dam and wheel there, he did not just harness the river, he commanded it. He controlled the flow for miles downstream. Every farmer whose field relied on that water, every villager who needed it for their animals, now had to consider the man at the mill. If he needed to repair his dam, he could slow the river to a trickle, wilting crops and parching livestock. If he opened his floodgates after a storm, he could send a destructive surge down the valley. This control over a fundamental natural resource transformed his economic power into tangible, environmental control. The mill was not just a business on the river, it was the gatekeeper of the river itself. This geographical advantage frequently erupted into open conflict. Downstream landowners would bitterly complain that the miller's dam was stealing their water, leading to lawsuits and sometimes even violent sabotage under the cover of night. A mill pond deliberately breached by angry neighbors was a common and catastrophic event. Yet the miller almost always held the upper hand. His operation was backed by the lord's legal privilege, making his claim to the water stronger than anyone else's. His mill became an unmovable economic and geographical choke point. The community needed his machinery to eat, and they needed his cooperation to water their fields. He stood at the center of a web of dependency, his power flowing as steadily as the river he had mastered. While the miller stood as the public face of power, the true engine of his enterprise was the team of men laboring in the dust-choked air. These were the miller's knaves, the paid workforce whose grueling, dangerous toil made the entire operation possible. Their existence alone was a stark symbol of the miller's elevated status. A farmer worked the land alongside his wife and children, a self-contained family unit. The miller, by contrast, commanded the labor of other men, free men who received wages. This ability to hire and manage a staff placed him firmly in the role of an employer, a capitalist in a world of subsistence laborers. The work these knaves performed was anything but simple. One might be stationed at the grain hopper, his eyes and ears constantly monitoring the flow of grain between the thundering stones. His most crucial skill was listening, identifying by sound alone the subtle shift in pitch that meant the stones were running too fast and burning the flour, or too slow and failing to grind it fine enough. Another knave would be a beast of burden, heaving 100-pound sacks of grain onto his shoulders, his lungs filling with a fine, abrasive dust that led to a characteristic cough known as the miller's wheeze. The environment was perpetually loud, damp, and treacherous. A loose sleeve caught in the complex gearing could mean a crushed arm or worse. A misstep on the slick, flour-coated wooden floor could send a man tumbling into the machinery or the mill race below. These men faced genuine physical danger every single day for a meager wage, and because they operated in the shadows just like their master, they were often viewed by the community as willing accomplices in his schemes. A farmer might suspect a knave of subtly underfilling a flour sack when his back was turned, or of being the one to expertly execute the kick to the measuring bowl. They were the hidden hands that could enact the miller's will, whether that will was honest or corrupt, making them figures of suspicion by association. The miller's wealth, therefore, was not just built on grain and water, but on his command over these invisible men, the human cogs who kept his industrial machine grinding forward. The miller's true power was baked into every single loaf of bread. In a world where bread was the fundamental currency of life, the man who controlled the flour held the entire village by its throat. Without his millstones, the hard-won harvest was just a pile of inedible grain. The process was a chain of absolute dependency, and the miller stood squarely in the middle of it. A farmer would finally thresh his wheat, separating the golden kernels from the stalks, but those kernels were tough and impossible to digest. They had to be transformed, and that transformation happened nowhere else but at the mill. The miller received the raw, hard grain and through the thunderous grinding of his stones, turned it into the soft, pale powder that was the very breath of the community. This flour was not a luxury, it was survival itself. The village baker could not bake without it. A housewife could not feed her family without it. Every person, from the lord in his hall to the lowest serf in his hut, relied on the miller's output for their daily sustenance. This gave him a form of leverage that was both immense and unspoken. He never had to threaten to shut down the mill. The mere possibility of a breakdown, a delay, or a dispute over his toll was threat enough. A village without a working mill for even a week would be a village on the brink of starvation. This invisible pressure ensured his demands were met, his authority respected, and his wealth secured, all because he alone held the key to turning hard grain into soft, life-giving bread. The miller's power was a direct extension of the lord's own authority, a partnership forged in law and profit. This relationship was a delicate dance of mutual need and simmering resentment. The lord provided the two things the miller could not get on his own: the legal monopoly that forced every peasant to the mill, and the immense capital required to build it. In return, the miller managed the daily operation, collected the grain tolls, and handed over a significant portion of the earnings to the manor. It was a feudal franchise agreement where the lord was the silent partner collecting royalties from a business he legally enforced. But this arrangement was not between equals. The lord saw the miller as a useful servant, a manager of a lucrative asset. The miller, however, often saw the lord as a distant financier, a necessary patron whose share of the profits was the price of doing business. A clever miller could turn this dynamic to his immense personal advantage. He was the one with his hands on the machinery and the ledger books. He controlled the accounting of how much grain came in and how much flour went out. This control over information was his ultimate weapon. He could subtly underreport the total volume of grain processed, pocketing the difference before the lord's share was ever calculated. Or he might claim higher expenses for repairs and maintenance, deducting those costs from the profits he was obligated to share. The lord, often disinterested in the gritty details of commerce, was reliant on the miller's honesty, a trait that was frequently in short supply. This meant a shrewd and unscrupulous miller could systematically siphon wealth from the very lord who empowered him. Over years, he could amass a personal fortune in coin and stored grain that rivaled, and sometimes even surpassed, that of a nobleman. Many lords, especially minor ones, were land-rich but cash-poor, their wealth tied up in fields and forests. The miller, by contrast, dealt in a constant, liquid stream of valuable commodities. He was not just the lord's partner. In the quiet of his counting room, he was often the lord's silent and superior rival. You could measure the miller's success not just in sacks of grain, but in the very walls he lived within. While his neighbors returned to cramped, single-room cottages of woven sticks and mud, the miller's home stood as a permanent statement of his wealth. It was often built directly attached to the mill itself, a constant reminder of the source of his power, and it was constructed from the most durable materials available. Where peasant huts were wattle and daub, his walls were often made of stone or solid timber framing, designed to last for generations. Stepping inside was to enter a different world. Instead of a dirt floor covered in rushes, he might have a floor of wooden planks or even paved stone. His family slept not on straw pallets in a corner, but in proper wooden beds, perhaps with a feather-stuffed mattress. His wealth was displayed in the tools of daily life. Where a peasant's wife cooked in a single clay pot over a central fire, the miller's household boasted metal cookware, knives of good steel, and wooden plates instead of hollowed-out bread trenchers. But the most telling sign of his status was on his table. The peasant's diet was monotonous, dominated by dark, coarse bread made from barley or rye and supplemented with thin vegetable pottages. The miller, however, ate the finest white bread baked from the very wheat flour he processed. His table regularly featured meat, fish, and cheese, foods that were luxuries for everyone else. His house was more than a shelter. It was a physical declaration of his separation from the community, a fortress of comfort built grain by grain from the labor of all his neighbors. This stockpiled grain was more than just food, it was a form of capital, and the miller became the village's unofficial banker. In a world with few coins, grain was the true currency of the realm. When a poor harvest left a family facing a long, hungry winter, their only hope was often a loan from the one man who always had a surplus, the miller. He would lend them a few sacks of grain to see them through, but this charity came with a heavy price. The terms were simple and brutal. For every sack borrowed now, the farmer would have to repay 1.5 or even 2 sacks after the next harvest. This was grain usury, a practice as old as civilization itself. Imagine a farmer desperate to feed his children agreeing to these terms. He knows that next year, a huge portion of his harvest will not feed his family, but will instead go directly to the miller's already overflowing granary. It is a devil's bargain, trading tomorrow's survival for today's. And if the next harvest was also poor, the debt became impossible to repay. The farmer could not declare bankruptcy. The miller's contract was not with a faceless institution, but with his neighbor. When the debt came due, the miller demanded payment in the only currency the farmer had left, his future labor or even his land. A farmer who could not repay might be forced to work for the miller for nothing or to surrender a strip of his precious farmland. Through this quiet, relentless process, the miller did not just accumulate grain, he accumulated the very means of production. His wealth grew not only from the tolls he collected, but from the futures he foreclosed on, transforming a temporary crisis for his neighbors into a permanent expansion of his own personal empire. But the miller's fortress of wealth was built on a foundation of perpetual peril. His entire empire was one spark away from ruin. Inside the wooden mill, the air was thick with flour dust, a highly explosive powder suspended everywhere. All it took was a single, unseen ember from the forge, a spark from a struck horseshoe on the cobbles, or the intense friction of a poorly greased axle grinding against wood, and the entire structure could vanish in a roaring fireball. There was no fire brigade, only a desperate bucket chain from the river, a hopeless gesture against an inferno fed by dry timber and airborne fuel. A single hour could erase a lifetime of accumulated grain and machinery. And the dangers did not only come from within. The very river that gave him power could also take everything away. A sudden, violent storm could swell the mill pond, overtopping his carefully constructed dam. The rushing torrent could tear the water wheel from its axle, splintering the gears and collapsing the mill house into the churning waters. A catastrophic mechanical failure was not a matter of if, but when. A snapped drive shaft or a shattered millstone could halt all production for months, draining his coffers for costly repairs and replacements while the unpaid tolls from unmilled grain piled up as lost income. Yet perhaps the most volatile threat was not from nature or machine, but from the people he served. The simmering resentment of the peasants could boil over into violent fury. A miller suspected of cheating with his false-bottomed sacks or rigged scales might find his mill the target of a nighttime raid. An angry mob, their hunger fueled by suspicion, would break his dam, smash his machinery, and set his granaries ablaze. This was not just random vandalism. It was a form of rough popular justice against a man perceived as a parasite on the community. The miller lived with a constant awareness that his wealth made him a target, his success a provocation. He balanced on a razor's edge, his fortune always just one disaster, one spark, or one angry crowd away from utter destruction. While the rural miller mastered his local stream, a new kind of milling empire was rising with the smoky skyline of the medieval town. Here, the rules of the game changed entirely. The urban miller was not serving a captive audience of peasants bound by a lord's decree. His customers were professional bakers and brewers, artisans who bought flour in bulk for their own thriving businesses. This was no longer about enforcing a feudal monopoly. It was about the pure, relentless engine of commerce. The scale was staggering. A single town mill, often powered by multiple water wheels or even early windmills, had to produce enough flour to feed thousands of city dwellers every single day. The urban miller was not just a craftsman, he was a wholesale supplier, the crucial first link in a complex urban food chain. His fortunes were tied to the growth of the town itself. As population swelled and demand for bread and ale skyrocketed, so too did his profits, often accumulating at a rate his rural cousin could only dream of. This concentration of wealth and shared interest led to one of the most significant developments in medieval business, the formation of milling guilds. These were not social clubs, they were powerful cartels created by the millers to protect their trade and control the market. The guilds established strict quality standards for flour, ensuring a consistent product for the bakers. More importantly, they acted as a unified front. They could negotiate better prices for grain shipments arriving by cart and boat. They could set milling rates that guaranteed a healthy profit for every member. And they fiercely guarded their territory, using their collective influence with the town council to block new competitors from setting up shop. A lone rural miller answered to his lord. An urban miller answered to his guild, an organization of his peers that existed for one primary purpose: to ensure that every member grew rich from the city's endless hunger. These guilds were fortresses of commerce built around one simple principle: strength in numbers. In a bustling medieval city, a lone miller was vulnerable. He could be undercut on price by a newcomer, or a baker might refuse to pay for a shipment of flour, claiming it was of poor quality. By banding together, the millers erased that vulnerability. The guild became their collective shield and their unified sword. Its first and most powerful function was to control the market. The guild would negotiate an exclusive agreement with the town council, essentially becoming the official, licensed supplier of flour for the entire city. They established a fixed price for their services, a multure rate that no member was allowed to undercut. This prevented destructive price wars that would have driven individual millers into bankruptcy. For the bakers and brewers, it meant a consistent, predictable cost for their most important raw material. the guild also enforced strict quality control. They appointed official inspectors, often senior millers themselves, who would periodically visit every member's mill. They would check the fineness of the flour, the condition of the millstones, and the accuracy of the scales. A miller caught selling coarse, poorly ground flour or using dishonest measures faced a heavy fine from the guild itself. This system protected the reputation of all the city's millers, assuring customers that guild-certified flour was the best you could buy. But the guild's power extended far beyond quality and price. It was a social and political engine. Membership was not automatic. A young man aspiring to become a master miller had to undergo years of training as an apprentice, then work as a journeyman before finally producing a masterpiece of his craft, a demonstration of his skill that the guild masters would judge. This long, costly process intentionally limited the number of new millers, ensuring that the existing members did not face too much competition. The guild also acted as a fraternal society. If a member's mill burned down or was damaged by flood, the guild would collect funds from all the others to help him rebuild. It provided for the widows and orphans of deceased members, creating a safety net that no individual could afford. This transformed the miller's status. In the countryside, he was a solitary, often resented figure. In the city, as a guildsman, he was a respected pillar of the community. He marched in civic parades, wore a distinctive livery on formal occasions, and had a direct voice in town affairs. The guild hall was a physical symbol of this collective power, a place where deals were struck, disputes were settled, and the millers cemented their position as the indispensable foundation of urban life, their fortunes secured not just by water and law, but by a powerful private alliance. The miller's wealth spun on a wheel of fortune as fickle as the seasons themselves. His entire business model relied on a constant, abundant flow of grain, but the medieval world was plagued by cycles of boom and bust that no legal monopoly could control. In a year of golden fields and full harvests, his prosperity seemed unshakable. The farmer's carts would arrive at his mill day after day, each one laden with the raw material of his fortune. His multure, that percentage taken from every sack, swelled his granaries to bursting. He collected his share not in unstable coin, but in the one commodity everyone always needed, food itself. This was the peak of his power, a time of plenty built directly upon the community's collective success. Yet the very source of his riches was also his greatest vulnerability. A single season of drought could turn those golden fields to dust. A week of torrential rain at the wrong moment could flatten the standing wheat, rotting it on the stalk. When the harvest failed, the stream of grain to his mill slowed to a trickle. The farmers had barely enough to feed their own families, let alone surplus to grind. His income from tolls plummeted overnight, and the relentless costs of maintaining his mill and paying his knaves continued unabated. A widespread cattle plague could be just as devastating, depriving the farmers of the oxen needed to plow and transport their grain, choking the supply chain at its source. Even worse was the arrival of pestilence. When disease swept through the crowded villages, it did not just kill people. It killed the labor force, fields went untended, harvests were left to rot, and the entire agricultural machine that fed his mill ground to a horrifying halt. In these desperate times, the miller faced the same economic collapse as everyone else, but from a vastly different position. While a peasant family might stare into an empty food chest after one bad harvest, the miller's security was measured by the height of the grain piled in his storage barns. Those stockpiled sacks accumulated during the fat years were his financial airbag. They were his buffer against the lean times, a private reserve that could sustain his own household for years. This stockpile also became his ultimate tool for wealth amplification during a crisis. He could sell his surplus grain at skyrocketing prices to the desperate, or lend it out at usurious rates, turning a subsistence crisis for his neighbors into a long-term investment for himself. The peasant feared starvation. The miller feared a downturn in his profit margin. This fundamental difference in security, all stemming from that hoarded grain, was the final, unbridgeable gap between the man who controlled the food and the people who merely grew it. The truth of the miller's wealth is not just in the old records but buried in the earth itself. Archaeology has unearthed the physical foundations of his power, and the story they tell is one of stark contrast. Excavations of medieval mill sites reveal foundations that are vastly different from any peasant home. Where a common dwelling might have simple post holes in the ground, the base of a watermill is a massive construction of packed stone and heavy timber, designed to withstand the constant, shuddering force of the turning wheel. This was not a structure built for a single lifetime, but for generations, a permanent investment in the landscape. The artifacts recovered from these sites speak volumes about daily life. Around a peasant's hut, archaeologists typically find fragments of coarse, locally made pottery and simple iron tools. At a miller's home, the dig often yields something far more telling: the distinctive glazed shards of imported pottery. These were jugs and bowls brought from distant trading centers, luxury items that signaled a disposable income and connections to a wider commercial world. Finding a scattered hoard of silver coins near a mill site is not uncommon, the tangible residue of a cash-based business in a largely subsistence economy. The most compelling evidence, however, lies in the remains of the miller's own house. It was frequently built of stone on a scale that dwarfs the surrounding village dwellings. His home featured separate rooms for different functions, a cellar for storage, and sometimes even a private fireplace, a rarity among the common folk. These stone footings and imported goods are the silent, undeniable testimony of a man who lived in a different world from his neighbors. The historical records of his riches are no longer just words on parchment. They are confirmed by the very stones he walked upon and the fine dishes from which he ate. The creak of the water wheel was soon joined by a new sound sweeping across the open plains, the rhythmic groan of wooden sails turning in the wind. From the 12th century onward, the windmill began to rise on hills and flatlands, a technological leap that shattered the old geographical limits of the miller's power. No longer was his empire confined to the riverbanks. Now, any lord with a windy hilltop could establish a new monopoly, and any ambitious miller could tap into a previously unreachable source of wealth. These towering structures, often built on costly stone towers, became castles of industry, their sails visible for miles, a constant reminder of the lord's authority and the miller's expanding reach. This was not just an alternative to water power, it was a declaration that the control over food processing could now be imposed almost anywhere. A village once too far from a strong river had been free to use hand querns, but the arrival of the windmill meant the lord's ban on home milling was suddenly enforceable, bringing a whole new population into the feudal economy of the toll. The miller who mastered this new technology did more than just grind grain. He captured the very wind, turning an invisible, boundless force into a steady, taxable income. Entire milling dynasties were founded not on water, but on air, their fortunes rising and falling with the gusts that swept across the open countryside. The miller's fortune did not end with his life. It was meticulously documented in the very last words he ever wrote. Probate records and wills from the medieval and early modern periods offer a stunning glimpse into the true scale of this wealth, revealing men who were not just comfortable but were veritable village magnates. These were not simple lists of a few personal possessions. They were complex legal documents detailing the transfer of a commercial empire. We find wills where a miller bequeaths to his eldest son not just the family home, but the mill itself, its water rights, its machinery, and all the associated land. This was not merely passing down a house, it was passing down a license to print money, a legally enforced monopoly that would guarantee the family's prosperity for another generation. The sums of hard cash mentioned are often staggering. One record might show a miller leaving his daughter a dowry of £100 in silver coin, a sum that would have been an impossible dream for the farmers who brought him their grain. To another son, he might leave a parcel of productive farmland acquired over a lifetime of shrewd grain loans. Every bequest, whether it was a new brass cooking pot for his wife or a silver spoon for his grandson, was a statement of a life lived in a different economic stratum. This intergenerational transfer was the ultimate consolidation of his power. A single successful miller could found a dynasty. His son, inheriting a fully operational and debt-free business, started his career a century ahead of any potential competitor. Over generations, these milling families accumulated more land, more influence, and more marital connections with the lower gentry. They built manor houses, sent their sons to be educated, and slowly, inexorably, their origins in flour dust were forgotten, replaced by the polished veneer of the landed class. The mill, that noisy, industrial heart of their wealth, became the engine of their social ascent, its relentless grind lifting an entire family name from common trade to local nobility. Yet this earthly wealth cast a long shadow over the miller's soul. From the stone pulpits of the parish church, a different kind of judgment was passed, one that no legal monopoly could silence. Preachers and priests regularly held up the miller as a textbook example of the deadly sin of avarice. In their fiery sermons, he was not a clever businessman but a soul in peril, a man whose pockets were filled with coin that rightfully belonged to his hungry neighbors. The very mechanics of his trade made him a perfect villain for a moral lesson. His closed doors and secret measures were not just business practices, they were metaphors for a heart closed to God and to charity. Congregations were warned that every extra scoop of grain taken through trickery was a weight dragging the miller's soul closer to damnation. This was not merely a social critique, it was a dire spiritual warning. The miller was told that his ill-gotten gains, while building a comfortable life on earth, were simultaneously constructing his own eternal prison in the afterlife. Imagine the internal conflict this created. Here was a man encouraged by the feudal system to be ambitious and wealthy, yet condemned by the church for the very same success. He sat in the pew each Sunday, surrounded by the families he was accused of cheating, listening to a priest describe the torments of hell that awaited the greedy. This added a profound layer of anxiety to his life, a constant tension between the tangible reality of his full granaries and the terrifying, invisible fate of his immortal soul. His daily work became a spiritual battleground where every transaction was a potential step toward worldly comfort or otherworldly fire. Even the strongest foundations can be washed away by the tides of history. The miller's fortress of power, built on legal monopoly and local necessity, did not stand forever. Its walls began to crack under the weight of a catastrophe so vast it rewrote the rules of society itself. In the middle of the 14th century, the Black Death swept across Europe, wiping out as much as half the population in a few horrific years. This was not merely a health crisis, it was an economic earthquake. With so many dead, the surviving peasants found themselves in a position they had never known before. They possessed immense bargaining power. Labor was suddenly scarce and therefore valuable. Lords who had once commanded now had to negotiate. Serfs could demand wages for their work or simply leave their home manors for lands where they would be treated better and paid in coin. This sudden shift in the balance of power weakened the entire manorial system, and the compulsory milling monopoly was one of its first casualties. A lord desperate to keep peasants on his land could no longer afford to strictly enforce the hated ban on hand mills. The old soak rights, once absolute, began to look more like suggestions as peasants gained the freedom to choose. The miller's captive audience was slowly being set free. At the same time, the very nature of wealth was transforming from grain to gold. The rise of a cash economy meant that rents and taxes were increasingly paid in money, not in bushels of wheat. A farmer could now sell his harvest for coin in a growing town market and use that cash to pay his lord. This simple change broke the miller's stranglehold on the food chain. He was no longer the only possible outlet for a farmer's surplus. His multure, the percentage of physical grain, became less relevant in a world where value was measured in silver pennies. The economic landscape was shifting beneath his feet, and his central, privileged position was starting to look like a relic of an older, more rigid time. This process of change was brutally accelerated by the enclosure of common lands. For centuries, peasants had relied on common pastures and woodlands to graze their animals and gather fuel. These lands were a vital part of their subsistence, a shared resource that cushioned them against poverty. But as the demand for wool grew, lords began to fence off these commons, converting them into private sheep pastures. This act of enclosure was a social disaster for the village. It pushed many small farmers off the land entirely, creating a new class of landless laborers who had no grain of their own to grind. The local, self-sufficient community that had been the miller's economic engine was being dismantled. With fewer independent farmers and more wage-dependent workers, the flow of grain to the manorial mill slowed to a trickle. The miller's wealth, so intimately tied to the rhythms of the peasant harvest, began to dry up at its source. The final, decisive blow came with the relentless roar of the Industrial Revolution. The water wheel and the windmill, once marvels of medieval engineering, were now quaint antiques. New steam-powered mills, built in burgeoning industrial cities, could produce flour on a scale that was unimaginable to the manorial miller. These factories did not rely on a local stream or a capricious breeze. They were powered by coal, and they could operate day and night, in any weather, grinding grain shipped from across the world. The economics were simply unstoppable. They produced flour cheaper, faster, and in greater quantities than any rural mill ever could. The old compulsory milling laws, already weakened, became completely unenforceable and then were formally abolished. Why would anyone be forced to use an expensive, inefficient local mill when cheap, high-quality flour could be brought in by train from the city? The miller's monopoly was not just broken, it was rendered utterly obsolete. The world had moved on, and the man who had once been the richest and most powerful figure in the village was left with a silent mill and a vanished empire, a ghost of a system that progress had left behind. So the miller's riches were never a simple secret but a layered fortress of power. His foundation was the law itself, the soak right that forced every villager to his door. Upon that legal bedrock, he built his fortune with the multure, a toll that siphoned a direct percentage from every harvest, ensuring his wealth grew with the community's labor. His control over the mill's advanced technology created a barrier no common person could cross, while his diversification into fulling and forging armored his income against any single failure. He was both essential and isolated, a pillar of the local economy and a target of deep suspicion. This complex figure stands at a historical crossroads. He was a product of the rigid feudal world, yet his cash-based business and managerial role pointed directly toward the modern age of commerce and industry. He was the man caught in the middle, growing rich on the very system that was slowly evolving beyond him. Do you have an old mill in your town or stories passed down about the miller who once lived there? Share your own local history and your thoughts on these controversial architects of medieval wealth in the comments below.